I want to ask you about Iraq because you mentioned earlier that you spent time there, and you talk in the book about this idea of the green zone. We can talk about this a little later on too, but the green zone in Baghdad is actually a very fluid thing in the world, as it turns out, as you discover. But tell me about your experiences there, and tell me how your theory in this book then applies I think probably most significantly to what happened in Iraq post-invasion.
I mean, the Iraq post-invasion was a classic example of the shock doctrine, because you had the shock of the war being harnessed to push through this, what the Economist magazine described as a capitalist dream. I mean, it was everything straight out of the Friedman playbook. It was a flat tax. It was absolute free trade. It was 100% foreign ownership of Iraqi assets, 100% expropriation of profits. And this was all just pushed through by Paul Bremer. He didn't have to negotiate with anyone. He was the government. He was signing decrees. He signed about 100 of them. So Plan A in Iraq was to turn the country into this free trade zone. Now that obviously failed, and when I was in Iraq, it was already clear that many Iraqis saw the economic program, the post-invasion economic program, as an extension of the war. I mean, if you see it from their perspective, they're being told they should compete with Walmart, General Motors, these huge global players. They don't even have electricity in their factories.
They had nothing, and they couldn't get it either.
They couldn't get it. Paul Bremer had a policy against supplying the state-owned companies with emergency generators because he didn't want to encourage their Stalinist ways. So, I mean, people, this is a major source of employment in the country. It's also a major source of national pride in the country. There's a strong tradition of economic nationalism in Iraq. So people did resist, and it wasn't just the people who were laid off from the public sector and the army who joined the Iraqi resistance, and there's a great deal of unanimity that this was the case. It's also the Iraqi business people who saw these policies as pillage, saw these American policies as pillage, who funded the resistance. So when I left Iraq at the end of 2004, I thought I was seeing a failure, that this attempt to turn Iraq, to create an economic boom after the war, they tried and they failed. But now I understand something different, which is that there has been an economic boom in Iraq. It just wasn't the Walmart, McDonald's, General Motors kind of economic boom that they had originally advertised. It's the Blackwater, Halliburton, Parsons, Bechtel economic boom, which is to say that the occupation has been privatized. So, I mean, the first plan was to privatize Iraq. That failed. They privatized themselves. I mean, the U.S. goes, it's postmodern, but the U.S. government is the only government that goes to war to loot itself. Right? To loot its own coffers, to loot its own army. And that's what's so surreal about the Green Zone. I mean, whenever I visited the Green Zone, I didn't stay in the Green Zone, but I went to the Green Zone fairly often to do interviews when I was in Baghdad. I had this real sort of sci-fi feeling of like, is this a future? Is this what happens when, these policies are just really taken to their logical conclusion? And I say that because it was like, the Green Zone is, it's really a city within a city. It's a gated city. It's a citadel. But it's like the Vatican, right? And if we think about a city within a city, except for it's Halliburton's Vatican. And as we know, everything in Iraq is not working. The lights aren't working, the water's not working, the sewage is in the streets, there's no security. But once you go through the gates of the Green Zone, after you've been through multiple checkpoints, suddenly everything works. The water,
I've been told this many times. The base has an ice skating rink in it. And
exactly.
That sort of thing.
And there's country and western night and the swimming pools, and all of it is run by private companies. So Iraq has become this experiment in corporate rule. And what's happening now is that these same companies that got a taste of these super profits with these no-bid contracts in Iraq are now bringing the model home. So after Hurricane Katrina, one of the first companies that showed up was Blackwater. I was there, and they were there within, I think, 2 days. They showed up saying, we're ready to, you clearly have a security problem, let us do it. And they, during the California wildfires, Blackwater was doing the same thing. They were saying, look, the state is failing, there's no adequate emergency response. Blackwater set up a tent city. So you have these sort of I guess it's a real synergy between the failed state and the fact that the U.S. is really run by a group of people. You mentioned Donald Rumsfeld, who'd studied under Milton Friedman, who fundamentally don't believe in the state. And the Bush administration is really the culmination of a 25-year campaign to privatize the state. And then you have these companies that have spent the past 7 years building a sort of shadow state, where Blackwater is the most frightening example of this, which, it has a tremendous arsenal, it has military bases, it has planes, fighter jets, helicopters, and they're saying, okay, well, the state's failed. You can't count on the government anymore, even in the context of increasingly intense natural disasters. We'll fill the gap. And this is what I mean by disaster capitalism, because this is a really frightening recipe where these companies see a market in an increasingly disastrous world. So you lose an incentive to address the most pressing issues of our time.
You talk about, in talking about the parallels between the green zone in Iraq and the green zone in New Orleans post-Katrina, the chapter where you talk about that, you talk about the fact that you were in a car accident, that you and Abby, your husband, and I guess there was your camera guy was with you as well, were in a car accident, and you ended up being strapped to a gurney and taken to a hospital, but you got taken to, well, you describe it, because therein was that was what showed the difference in New Orleans. So as you say, we got in a car accident in New Orleans during the flood. The city was, the floodwaters had receded at this point, and you were allowed to go into the city, but it was still a mess, and there weren't traffic lights, so we had a T-bone collision at an intersection, and I was hospitalized because I had a mild concussion, and the back window had shattered, and I needed stitches in my neck. And I was strapped to a gurney, put on in an ambulance, and I was really afraid because I had been visiting health clinics, and they were, a nightmare. We all saw the images from, remember, the airport in New Orleans, where we kept seeing images on television of people strapped to their wheelchairs falling over, and really unsanitary conditions. And this was a fairly minor injury that I had, so I was trying to convince the guys in the ambulance just drop me off and just let me. I was like, I'm fine, I'm fine, I'm fine. I didn't realize I had a concussion, and I passed out while I was arguing with them, and woke up, lo and behold, in this pristine sort of spa-like environment. So my worst fears were allayed. I was not only in a nice hospital, I was in the nicest hospital I have ever been in, and I didn't have to wait for a private room. I was just wheeled right into a private room. 3 nurses took me immediately to get an x-ray of my neck. I was, I had 3 doctors attending to me, including a young intern. And I was just actually making conversation with him. I asked him whether he'd worked the hurricane, and he said, no, thank God, I didn't have to, which I thought was sort of a strange response, considering this was a young man right out of medical school, and people, doctors from Canada were going to the hurricane zone just to help. So I just thought, okay, this is fresh-faced kid. Wouldn't you want to help? This is a disaster in his city. And so I said, well, did you go to any of the shelters? And it hadn't even occurred to him. Yes, I didn't think of that.
Didn't think of it. And it was in that moment where I really thought, okay, what we'd just seen in New Orleans, where the people who had resources, had access to cars, were able to just drive out of the disaster zone and check into a hotel and call their insurance brokers, and the people who depended on the state were just left to drown. That's kind of a fast-forward version of what happens every day in New Orleans, right? Where if you don't have medical insurance, you go to a terrible hospital, like Charity Hospital, which hasn't even been reopened. And these, medical students who are products of the private education system and private healthcare system, it never even occurs to them that they could help. So, as a Canadian, this really had a strong effect on me, because it really made me realize that once you make that fundamental calculation that is so much a part of a 2-tiered healthcare system, once you decide, okay, well, access to funding is going to decide in some cases who gets access to potentially a life-saving test or medicines or care. Once you make that decision in the day-to-day, then it isn't that far removed to make that same calculation in a moment of disaster, which I think we're starting to see more and more.